So I'm going to pass over to Dr. Geetha Reddy now, who's going to share her slides, and she's going to speak for 20 to 30 minutes, and then we'll have a chance for a Q&A session after that. And so, if you do have questions, you can either type them into the chat, and we can field them in that way and ask them to Geetha, or if you'd like to directly ask her a question, then just put your hand up and we'll invite you to ask your question. I'm Paul Stenner, I should say. I've done the introduction, and Peter Hegarty, who's with me, the co-director of the Open Psychology Research Centre, will take the questions. So, we'll not take the Geetha will take the questions, but we will field the questions.
That's a relief.
That's a relief. So over to you, Geetha, and thank you very much for taking your precious time in the evening to give this talk. Over to you.
Okay, so thank you so much, both of you, for inviting me, and I'm really glad that we have some students here to join us on this discussion this evening. I'm going to be speaking about how are precarity and social psychology interwoven, and trying to tease apart some of these connections. And I'm very excited to chat more with you about what you think these concepts are and how we as psychologists can understand them and address some of these issues that come across when we are engaging with in and within precarity. So today's talk would be about 20 to 30 minutes. I'm going to keep an eye on the time. I will begin with my point of departure, so telling you how I come into studying this and thinking about this topic, and then going into some ideas of precarity that have been discussed across the social sciences, and then trying to tease apart these connections within social psychology. So precarity is something very real in our everyday lives, in our everyday discourse, especially in the UK. I think when we hear all of these strikes that are happening, from the NHS strike to the rail strike, to the Royal Mail strike, and also the UCU strikes, we are seeing people understand the impact of precarity on their lives and telling us to take notice, those of us who are not intimately affected by it, telling us to take notice of how all these different strikes are interconnected and how our lives are all interconnected. And when someone is struggling with the poor contracts that they are facing, the poor working conditions that they are in, how that affects all of us. So this is something which is very real and very present to me, and I'm sure to all of you as well. And so the question then is, how can we survive? How do we survive out of this state that we are in? And I think about this a lot, and I have to admit I don't have all the answers, and I'm hoping that by sharing some of these things that I have learned with you, that we can have a discussion and perhaps we can talk about how we can get through some of these conditions together. So my colleagues and I put together a special issue called Towards a Social Psychology of Precarity. It's at the British Journal of Social Psychology. It holds, this volume holds 10 articles together, and these are my colleagues Claire Kultas and Johanna Lucata, who worked together with me in putting this special issue together. So there are a total of 10 articles from different authors from the UK, different scholars from the UK and outside of the UK, all thinking about what does it mean to build a social psychology of precarity? What truly is the social psychological lens on precarity, and how are we as psychologists contributing to the understanding, but also contributing to the precarization of our worlds today? Johanna, Claire, and I looked at a lot of social science literature in trying to understand what the state of affairs is in the academic understanding of precarity. So we came up with 5 sort of categories or themes that we saw from the social sciences across, anthropology, political science, human geography, sociology, and so on. One of the key elements that seem to be common to all of these understandings of precarity is that it structures relations. So Guy Standing wrote in 2011 that the precariat are a group of people who, a new category of people who are typically in insecure positions within the workplace. And how this comes about is that there are unequal power relationships in the workplace. So precarity is something that structures relations. Precarity is also a process. What do we mean by that? Scholars Philo and their colleagues say that precarity is made, and Priya Deshinger in Sussex says also unmade. It's made and it's unmade. It's a processual being becoming rather than a timeless structural property. So it's not a fixated point or a fixed point, but rather it is a making and an unmaking of fragility. Precarity is also a hopeful and a hopeless place. So Srila Roy, who's a scholar in South Africa, talks about how interventions that were aimed at supporting the precariat in India, in the end, actually produce precarity. Ironically, also produce precarity. So precarity can be a place of hope, because we are thinking of how do we actually create sustainable solutions that lift people out of precarity, but they can also bring people back to precarity, which shows its vicious cyclical nature. Lastly, the scholars also talk about how precarity is generatively ambivalent. And what do they mean by that? That precarity can both result in violence and breakdowns in communication across differences, but it can also foster connections and collaborations. So in trying to form solidarity, in trying to create movement and unions across different political issues, we can find some connections and collaborations in our differences. So there is an element of a positive generativity in this, but it's also because of the way that these connections and collaborations are created is a result of different forms of violences. So it could be physical violence, could be epistemic violence, violence of knowledge that that some communities experience. So there are different types of violence that also bring these people together. So we have to hold both of these emotions, feelings, and ways of being that come into existence because of precarity. So in this special issue that I spoke about, there were 10 papers, and they showed us some things when we look when we look out towards the issues that society is facing. So social psychology provides us with many different tools to understand precarity outside. So there is a range of theories that scholars in these 10 papers have used. So social representations theory by Kessi Mahendran, who is a professor at our university. Social identity theory and systems justification theory by Nihan, who is also Albayrak Aydemir, who is also an OU postdoctoral fellow, and Ilka Geipes. They use these 2 different theories. Time-space dissociation by Schmidt et al. They are colleagues in the US. They also use different types of methods, so qualitative methods and quantitative methods and participatory methods. So there are many tools that we have within psychology to help us understand precarity, and all of these things were fleshed out so beautifully in these 10 papers. And what all of these papers showed us is that the social psychological element in understanding precarity enables us to go beyond individual understandings of suffering and coping that usually underpin blame discourse. So when we think about people who are experiencing precarity, there's a lot of discussion about how they have put themselves in those positions and how they deserve to be there. Or that this is how the way of the world is, you know, a lot of us are in this together, so just suck it up and get on with it. And all of these papers have done something to help us think about beyond the sort of individual understanding of suffering and pain that comes from precarity, and coming to the conclusion that actually there is a precariousness to all our existences. You know, there's a common understanding or a common misunderstanding that a lot of people are actually much closer to, you know, being millionaires and billionaires than they are to actually being unhoused. So many people actually, you know, a few paychecks away from actually being unhoused and homeless. But there's always this conversation which tips it away from this, and this idea that, you know, people who are unhoused are, you know, benefit scroungers and so on, rather than thinking, and so aligning yourself along with, you know, the 1% of this population, of this global population who actually don't experience precarity in the way that most of the others do. When we're thinking about this special issue as editors, what we found was there was this idea of looking in, looking out. So these are all these methods and theories that help us to understand precarity, that are specific, you know, psychological tools that we actually have. But then there was a lot that helped us to reflect within the field, to think about what are our limitations in understanding precarity and what is our complicity in perpetuating precarity. And for the next bit of this talk, actually, I want to spend some time looking at one of the papers which I had co-written together with my colleague, Amina Amar, who's at the University of Greenwich. So in this paper called The Precarious Engagements and the Politics of Knowledge Production, Listening to Calls for Reorienting Hegemonic Social Psychology, we operate from the perspective that knowledge production, so how we understand what we know in psychology, is unequal, is built upon endangering precarity in the field, and is rooted in coloniality. But when we are thinking about how to create a more inclusive and diverse field, all of these 3 points are not really thought about. So what is coloniality? Coloniality is the violence of colonialism that is not confined to a particular time period. So when we think about colonization, when we think about colonialism, we think about something that has happened in the past, that we are over, that we just need to recognize that this is something that happened, but it no longer defines our worldview, the way that we behave, the way that we think, the way that we operate in this world. And coloniality is this understanding that actually the effects of colonialism are no longer need to be seen as confined to a particular period of time, and that it continues today. Coloniality is even seen to be so invisible that we actually don't know that we are living and breathing coloniality. And what we mean by this is, so some scholars have been pulling this apart and trying to explain to us what is coloniality and what do we mean by living and breathing in coloniality. That the ways of knowing, the ways that we know our world to be, how power is defined, how power is enacted, how power structures the world, and our very being, so how we exist in this world, it was all formed during colonial occupation, and it continues to persist even after the formal end of colonial rule. So many countries which were colonized by the British have actually gained some form of independence or political independence. So many countries around the world celebrate, Independence Days. But the way that coloniality functions is that despite receiving independence from the British government or the British colonial government, these countries still continue to live in the shadow of colonialism. And this violence of colonialism is not just the material, occupation of the land that, of course, in many countries no longer exists, but it extends to the mind and to the body. When we think about psychology's role in producing knowledge, we will come to that later. We have historically understood that Darwinism and eugenics, which talk about putting people into hierarchies and categorizing people into these categories and into these hierarchies, is what defined a lot of the ways that psychologists were thinking about people historically. And the focus was really on, what are these neurological differences between different racialized groups of people? And so Professor Shose Casey, who is the Dean of Humanities at the University of Cape Town, a social psychologist, talks about how a decolonial turn for psychology will also mean us moving away from thinking as the individual, so as a single person, as the central unit of analysis, in a way that overlooks and allows us to, not think very deeply about the context within which people are finding themselves. And what is this context? This context is the economic context, the social context, and the political context. So my colleagues and I that Paul introduced earlier, the Read Surah Decolonial Editorial Collective of Shanaz Safla, who's the woman on the left, and then we have Glenn Adams, and then Kopano Retteli at the bottom right. The four of us have put together 3 special issues on understanding decolonial approaches in and of psychology. So there are these 3 issues in the Review of General Psychology and the Journal of Social Issue, 2 journals in psychology that cut across various subdisciplines. So social psychology, cognitive psychology, political, developmental, organizational, and so on. We also put together 5 webinars on these topics. So if you're interested, I will send a link around to Paul, who can then disseminate this on the OPRC site. And they are different webinars focusing on different issues of coloniality. So if you're interested in understanding a bit more about this, they're all on YouTube for you to peruse in your own free time. So coming back to this paper, when we're talking about knowledge production within hegemonic psychology that is rooted in coloniality, we understand, as I mentioned earlier, this idea of neurological differences that psychology's foundation is based upon. So we know that the early studies of psychology were talking about differences in brain sizes and that how it relates to someone's intelligence. Psychology was also focused on taming the natives, so taming the indigenous populations of the countries and communities that they colonized. We also know about the racist knowledge production when we're thinking about a hierarchy of knowledge, that colonial knowledge was then seen as the top of the pyramid, and that indigenous knowledge and wisdoms were not seen as worthy of preservation or worthy of understanding, and seen as generally inferior. When we think about this, what does it mean when this knowledge produced is built upon endangering precarity within the field? A lot of universities, as I'm sure you have understood and see in speaking to other university students or on social media, talk about what it means to decolonize, and they say that they're very focused on decolonizing their curriculum, decolonizing their education systems. But at the same time, a lot of these, in the same breath, these institutions will also talk about deducting, 100% of the wages of the people who are going on strike. So precarity and decoloniality in this sense are seen to be at odds or in tension with one another. But what we are saying, my colleagues and I, is that it is within the institutional framework, is it within the understanding of how knowledge is produced and reproduced in the university, that colonization or decolonization and precarity are not actually at odds, but need to be going hand in hand. So what we do in this paper is then to see how are the ways that, knowledge production within psychology, and in particular within social psychology, continues to engender precarity. So we developed an understanding of, how we built 5 different interdependent elements, and then we talk about how each of these elements actually make up this machinery of knowledge production. So how knowledge is produced in our universities, within our field of psychology. And then we talk about how these things continue to create precarity. So I'll give you a brief image of what these 5 interdependent elements are. And then we can talk about this in the Q&A if you would like to. So the center of these the center of this, how this knowledge production engenders precarity, is that the foundations of our field are colonial. So colonial epistemological foundations. What that means is how we see the world in its way today is centered on colonial understandings of the world. This main center cog drives these other cogs in the machinery. So it drives how knowledge is disseminated within the university. It drives how knowledge is documented within the university. Documentation of knowledge, for example, what kind of journal articles is our knowledge produced, inscribed in. So we understand, we conduct a research project, and then we decide these are the journals that we are going to discuss our project in. We are going to show our findings in these particular journals only. So this is one way that documentation of knowledge takes place, when we choose only specific journals that we want to describe our findings in and then disseminate our findings in. So documentation of knowledge and dissemination of knowledge are interconnected. We use particular wide stream theories and methods on how we decide, to understand a particular topic. So for example, if we are thinking about understanding love, what theories of love are we using to then go out to understand how people experience love every day? If we are using theories that are born only from this part of the world, what we are doing is then imposing a particular worldview about love onto other communities who may not share the same understanding of love. And when we are doing this, of using these particular theories that are founded and have been developed in this part of the world to other parts of the world, we are reinscribing colonial power dynamics. We are trying to universalize a particular theory founded from a particular place to the rest of the world. So these are the 5 cogs of the machinery that we discuss that turn the gears going about how knowledge is produced within academia. We keep the image open so that we encourage, other scholars, new scholars, to add different cogs into this visualization. But our idea is that there are multiple cogs which are turning together that then perpetuate precarity within the academy. Why all of this is so important is that this idea of looking inwards, when we are psychologists who are studying particular issues, challenges, problems of the world today, if we don't see how we ourselves are perpetuating these problems, we are not doing justice to the science, we're not doing justice to ourselves. And in my opinion, we're not doing justice to our goal of trying to eradicate precarity or find, solutions to some of these challenges that we are experiencing. So this idea of including the measurer, a great quotation by MC Hammer on Twitter, when he says, "You bore us. If a science's commitment to truth, shall we cite all the historical known truths perpetuated by scientists? It's not science versus philosophy, it's science plus philosophy." So you have to measure, when you measure, to include the measurer, that's ourselves, when we are trying to understand social issues of today. I end by talking about what does it mean to find these solutions. So coming back to this first image that we had, how do we end precarity? It's complicated. these guiding principles, which I'm inviting us to think about, are related to what it is that we are trying to do when we are functioning as psychologists or functioning as scholars, as thinkers, to find solutions for some of these issues that we are all facing today. And if we find solutions that come at the expense of someone else's well-being, can we truly be asking ourselves if we are finding solutions, or are we just adding to the problem? So to think about what is the cost that this solution comes at when we are going out into the world and using the knowledges that we have gained from our university to then alleviate and ameliorate some of the social issues out in the world. On that note, I will end. Thank you so much for listening to me, and I look forward to a deep discussion.
Thank you, Geetha, for giving of your time and of your ideas this evening. That's fantastic. So I do have some thoughts of my own. That was a broad-ranging talk and a challenging one on a number of fronts.
Great.
So I think I would like to first see if there are questions coming through the chat, or if anyone wants to put a hand up. And I'll hold my own questions in abeyance and give the floor to the students. Fantastic. Geetha, I could go on all night.
So can I.
I know, but we are coming towards the end of our time. So I just want to thank you once again for a really generous talk and a really fulsome question and answer period as well.
Yeah.
Thanks to the students for coming along and for engaging, particularly to Daniel for your questions.
Yes, great question.
Thank you to Paul for hosting tonight. We're in Paul's house tonight. We were in my house last time. We do
Love
this.
it.
So folks, this will be our last of these lectures for this academic year. We'll be back in the next academic year. And finally, I just want to give a shout out as well to the CoLab. For those of you who may not know about the CoLab, have a look at the OPRC website. And in all likelihood, we will be drawing the two projects of the CoLab and these lectures a little bit closer together in the coming academic year. But we'll more about that in due course. For now, thank you very much, Geetha.
Thank you, Geetha.